Hi, and welcome to episode 1 of the Pharmacy Lounge Law and Ethics podcast series. This is a new series, and we're really focusing on the law and ethics side and legal disputes. And we have our lawyer, Paul Summerfield, with us, and we will be going through some real life cases in this series. And one of the inspirations for this was from all the questions that we have on the Pharmacy Lounge and on the various Telegram locum groups where people ask all sorts of legal questions. So we're hoping through this series, it'll be able to give you a much better understanding of how the legal system works, what you should and shouldn't do. I mean, a lot of it's common sense, but understanding the law and how to apply it does make life a hell of a lot easier. So we have Paul Summerfield with us again today. And Paul, before we start, do you want to tell us a bit more about yourself and your expertise in the legal field?
Yeah, of course. A lot of our listeners, viewers, will know me from various Telegram groups, both TPC and non-TPC. And they will know a little bit of my background. But very briefly, qualified as a pharmacist in 1997. I got called to the bar in 2007, and I'm an unregistered barrister. I've worked for a defence organisation in 2008 to 2010, representing pharmacists at that stage. But then I set up a company called Pharmaceutical Defence Limited in 2012, and I've been representing healthcare registrants ever since. Hopefully that answers your question.
It does, and thank you for that. So on to our first case today. You've got a really interesting one about covering up mistakes, something I've seen happen quite a lot in the past. I think a lot of pharmacists will see a mistake and like, oh, it's okay, it's something serious. Not realizing that the serious implications it can have on your professional career. So tell us a bit more about this one, Paul, and how that was dealt with.
Okay, so basically, just overview of what we should be doing to begin with. We all make mistakes. It's inevitable. We're human. Put a human into a process ideally set up for automation, and I know a lot of people will be taking breath there, but the dispensing process is set up for an automated process. It is. Break it down to its constituents. You'll see where I'm coming from. You put a human into that chain, you're going to get all sorts occurring. And you may get errors occurring as well. And I'm not going to go into the psychology of how errors occur, but they will. So we're all going to make an error at some point. Some will make more errors than others. Doesn't necessarily mean you're a bad pharmacist or you're an incompetent pharmacist. So the best one in the world, errors are going to occur. And it's how we deal with those errors which is extremely important. Even now, 23 years as a pharmacist, I still make errors. I'm not going to turn around and say I don't, because I'd be lying to you. But I do make errors. And that horrible gut feeling you get when you've made an error, or it's been brought to your attention, will never go away. But it's about how you deal with that. That's the important thing. And what I'm going to do now, along with tutorial, is take you through an extreme example of what happened when an error wasn't dealt with appropriately. So what we've got is we've got a very busy pharmacy on a very busy day on a Friday. And what happens is a methadone error occurs. It can happen. And it did happen. And what happened afterwards was defined how the GPHC dealt with it. So the error was a multiple of a daily dose. It was brought to the pharmacist's attention and they didn't record it. They were asked about it and they denied it. They were asked about it again and they said they didn't have any recollection of it. This went on for about 9 months until they said, actually, yes, I do remember what was going on. This got to the GPHC. It was an error. It was an error involving a controlled drug. But there was a gut feeling that something wasn't quite right. So it got to the GPHC. I became involved in it. A person came to me for some advice and ended up coming on board. So I represented them at the hearing. What basically came out in the hearing is that they had tried to cover the error up. So they were being dishonest. And the test that they used for dishonesty has changed. The test used to be, if you didn't think you were being dishonest, you weren't being dishonest. However, now the test is, if you're being dishonest and another member of the public, an ordinary member of the public, concedes being dishonest, then dishonesty is shown as proven. And this is what happened here. It was held that they were being dishonest by trying to cover up the error. Now, the chair stated that if the error had have been recorded promptly and the duty of candour had have been followed correctly, it would have been very doubtful that this would have even got through the doors of the Fitness to Practice Committee hearing room, because it would have been dealt with further down the line and that would have been the end of it. However, this wasn't the case. So in this extreme case, the registrant, because of the cover-up, got a 6-month suspension. Now, there's a lot we can learn from that. And what I'm going to do is going to invite Toril to ask just a couple of questions for clarification before I start going on to looking at how we can best avoid an appearance in front of the GPHC Fitness to Practice Committee.
I was reading the case myself last night, and what I found really interesting was it could have been quite easily avoided. Yeah. It was all they had to do with it, admit that, yes, I made a mistake. And these things, as you said, we're human, these things do happen. But he carried on saying for 9 months that he didn't do anything. So, I mean, in this situation, because I'm trying to figure out, a pharmacist, normal average local pharmacist or manager working in a busy pharmacy store, you would generally just go out and say, I made a mistake, call up the GP and say, look, they have had an overdose. We've prescribed them, we've given them higher strength or higher amounts of methadone than they were supposed to have. And they would have dealt with it, slap on the wrist maybe, and that would have been the end of it. Why did the pharmacist decide to keep denying it for 9 months?
It's more to do with the fear of the consequence of making an error and the sequelae after that. So, none of us like to make errors. Let's be honest, none of us like to make errors. I don't like to make errors. Toril, you don't like to make errors. When you're a pharmacist, the perception of the public is that you are going to be error-free because you're dealing with medication. That perception is mainly correct, but there'll be a lot of things in the background as well. This was explored in this case. There's a lot of things going on in the background in relation to personal life and professional life, which culminated in the decision not to be open and honest and to report the error. So really, when you look at it, there's always going to be an explanation as to why it doesn't happen, okay, or why something has happened. And this was the case here. There's a lot of things going on in the background in relation to certain matters, personal and non-personal. And unfortunately, they all met on this one day. And the conscious decision was taken to try and retreat and hide away from what had happened. And unfortunately, that came back to bite this pharmacist quite badly, to be honest. In order, this chap was suspended for 6 months for an error.
Uh-huh.
That is how serious the committee took the cover-up. So therefore,
the pharmacy shouldn't really be covering up. We need to have that honesty and transparency, both with ourselves, our colleagues, and with the public. Once you start covering up, obviously the public loses trust, not just in you as an individual, but also the profession. And once it impacts the professional image of the rest of us, that has a much bigger impact than just you as an individual covering up something which you may have thought was a small mistake or a minor one, and you didn't want to admit to it. And I've heard so many cases where locums have gone into a branch, they made a slight error, and that was reported straight away. But when it was made by the employed pharmacist, that was never reported, or they don't get reported as much. I think that there's another area there that we can probably look into on a later podcast, that in terms of when it comes to honesty and transparency, it has to apply across the board, not just for one group of pharmacists.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, when you're looking at the standards, which the GPHC will do in depth at these points, standard 6, display professional behaviour at all times. So by not being open and honest, by actually withholding the report, by consciously making that decision, you're not displaying professional behaviour. Yeah, so that links into standard 6. Just looking at the standards now, just as an aid memoir. Providing person-centred care. By not reporting the error, you're not providing person-centred care. Why are you not providing person-centred care? Because it could be a very serious error. You're shying away from it. You're not reporting it. You're not letting the other individuals in that person's care know about it, or that patient's care know about it. Therefore, that could have disastrous results for that patient. Mm-hmm. It works in with standards 2 and 3 as well, working in partnership with others, not only within the pharmacy, but the wider healthcare team, communicating effectively. Again, you're not communicating effectively by withholding information regarding an error. Using professional judgment. In this case, professional judgment wasn't used. The judgment that was used was, let's shy away from this, let's hide away from this. So you weren't using professional judgment. Speaking up when things go wrong. That didn't happen. Mm-hmm. And demonstrating leadership. To demonstrate leadership, you say and do things which potentially you may feel personally are not right, but it is the right thing to do. Therefore, owning up, which falls into 6 as well, behaviour in a professional manner, but demonstrating leadership, showing that when something goes wrong, and if you are at the centre of that, because it is an error that has occurred on your shift, you demonstrate leadership by saying, yes, it was me. I was at fault. I take responsibility. So you can see there how it links into the standards. And this is how the GPHC, when prosecuting, when presenting, I say prosecuting because that's what they're doing, they're prosecuting a case, but when they're presenting a case, that is how they will do it. They will look at the standards and they will say your behaviour either fitted in or didn't fit in. Mm-hmm. And they'll go through exactly that, along with adding the case law. A lot of the case law is from the High Court. It is involving doctors, but the principles are the same for pharmacy professionals. So being able to match the behaviour to the principles is a very important part of a fitness to practice case. But what's also a very important part as well is for the pharmacist to get across what they've learned, how they've changed their practice, what they've put into place to change their practice. And this is known as insight. Now, insight, you can write reams and reams and reams on pages. Yes, that's great, but it's on paper. The best way for a committee to assess insight is by that person giving evidence. Now, I would always advise, if something went to the GPHC, you start writing a reflective account. Because by writing a reflective account, it looks at how you approach the situation, but also it gives an indication and an insight as to your thought processes as well. Now, a lot of times, pharmacists and other healthcare professionals, we're not a sole group here, will reflect on the personal consequences of what's happening. So the personal consequences of an error. That is not sufficient insight. To show sufficient insight, you also need to look at the impact of the error on the profession as a whole and into this thing called public confidence of the profession. So what would a member of the public think of a pharmacist or a healthcare professional who covered up an error? How would the profession think of a pharmacist or a healthcare professional who covered up an error? Would they think that is behaviour befitting of a professional? So you've also got to be looking at how your behaviour impacts not only upon the public confidence aspect, but also on the confidence within the profession itself. Because remember, the GPHC are there not only to maintain public confidence, to maintain public safety, but they're also there to maintain, uphold and declare proper standards within the profession as well. And those three put together are the public interest, or is the public interest element of a fitness to practice case. So you've got to be looking wider than what's the impact on you? How has it affected me? You've got to look wider than that. And if you can do that, you can demonstrate insight. And that's what a vast majority of this is about. If you can demonstrate sufficient insight, if it's at this stage, the sanction will most likely be at the lower end of the scale, instead of somebody who shows no insight and the sanction is up there. It's right at the top. Now, dishonesty, going back to the case in hand, dishonesty in any profession is a very serious matter. But not all cases of dishonesty will lead to removal, and that's in the guidance for the fitness to practice committees. And it's quite common guidance which goes throughout the various healthcare profession regulators. So when you look at that, you've got to start to think how to mitigate against that. Hopefully you'll never be there because you'll never do it. Mm-hmm. But you never know what's around the corner. You never know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
One thing I would say is if it's a one-off, it's probably going to end up with a lower sanction. But if it's repeated behaviour, then that's probably going to bump it into the higher sanction range. Because committees will remember that the best predictor of future behaviour is past behaviour. And the classic example here is the pharmacist who was ultimately convicted of murder in 2018. Quite a bit of past behaviour there of getting away with things. And unfortunately, I followed through. And the guy was convicted and is spending a minimum of 30 years behind bars for what he did. But we won't go into that because that is an extreme case. We can go into it, but at a later date. It pulls up quite a few other principles that we need to talk about as well. So as we can see in this case, the insight wasn't there fully to begin with. So therefore, the sanction was quite higher range. Now, with the suspension, they could have suspended for 6 months. Sorry, start again. With suspension, they could have suspended for 12 months. That's the maximum they can do for a suspension. So this was a mid-range suspension of 6 months. And that was given to allow the practitioner, in this case a pharmacist, to fully develop insight and to reflect on what had happened. And when the review came round, that's exactly what had happened. There had been other intervening factors in those 6 months. The pharmacist showed a very, very great level of insight, was discussing it openly, what had happened, had declared it to a future employer in a different profession, and got some absolutely cracking testimonials in order to show that. Gave evidence, and the committee preferred the evidence, found this pharmacist, very credible, combined with the testimonials and the fact that this pharmacist had developed a great level of insight. At that point, then stated that the fitness to practice of that pharmacist was no longer impaired and they could return to the register on the expiry of their suspension. Some pharmacists aren't so lucky and develop insight but don't develop sufficient insight. And as a result, they're resuspended. There's nothing stopping a committee resuspending or putting conditions on for up to 3 years, or actually removing if they feel that the pharmacist has not engaged with the process and certainly has not got the required level of insight that would be expected after such a term of suspension. So basically, it's known as an all options open hearing for sanction, and that can happen. Pharmacists have been removed after a suspension. Other pharmacists have had conditions placed on their registration for up to 3 years. So the committee can convince themselves, and the council can convince themselves that they are fit to practice.
So I think this is really interesting because it really is an extreme one. So I think the gist of it is basically just be honest and open about any errors that you make. Covering up, you might think you can get away with it. You might do on one occasion, maybe 2 occasions, but eventually you'll catch up with you on the 3rd one. And that's when things get really serious, and it's not really worth losing your license over this. Sometimes the best solution is just to put your hands up and say, I made the mistake, and just face the consequences.
It's the fear of that which stops people doing it. However,
and I think I have seen this in a lot of pharmacists throughout the years when I've worked in different branches. An error happens, and you take it back to the man and say, oh, look, I think this is one of you. Oh, no, it wasn't me. Who else signed it? Who dispensed it? Who did this? Who did that? I mean, look, you are the last person. You're the pharmacist in charge. It's got your signature on it. It happened. Just make sure it doesn't happen again. But as soon as you tell someone that this mistake has happened, this error has happened, it's like they have the fright of their life. And I think we need to try and be more realistic with how we see ourselves. We're human at the end of the day. We can make errors. I know the public has a perception that we're the last people to get the prescription, and when everything, we do the final checks and everything goes right. But in the current climate where you've got understaffing, you're overworked, currently with the COVID pandemic where you've got next to no staff and even more work, we're going to be facing more and more situations where more and more mistakes are happening and errors are going through. So the best way to deal with it is just to own up and say, this has happened. Look at the root cause. Was a staffing issue? If it was a staffing issue, if you didn't have any staff or enough staff, or you're overstressed, say it, because that's the only way we can get to dealing with the other issues around the environment itself. Or if you just slipped up, and that's really all you can say on that one, that you've made a mistake. And that, to be honest, I think, like I said, as a practicing pharmacist myself, whenever I've made errors, I've said, yeah, I made the error. I can't blame it on anyone else. I probably should have paid more attention. Well, I should have paid more attention, or it was just a mistake. Can't really do anything much about that. And I think, again, like I said, Paul, in your experience as pharmacist, a local pharmacist, have you come across people? I'm sure you've probably come across a lot of other pharmacists that you've worked with. How do people generally respond when you tell them, "Oh, you've made this error"?
Well, you see the look of despair, for want of a better phrase, that comes across the face. Nobody likes to be told that they're not perfect. Nobody likes to be told that they've made an error. And especially in healthcare, nobody likes to be told that they've made an error which could potentially impact a patient and their health and their well-being. So the reactions tend to be either, are you sure it was me? Or, no, it wasn't me. Or actually, yeah, it must have been me. And then you get, yeah, definitely was me. So you've got to, but the range of responses is extremely wide. As you've quite rightly mentioned, regardless of how you feel inside, that patient, that person is at the top of the list of everything that you do. And it's their welfare that you need to be more concerned with about your own personal feelings. Yeah, your stomach may be going, your heart rate goes up, you may feel sweaty, you may feel sick when you've realised what's happened. But that patient, it's happened to them. They should be your top priority. One of the things I always do when I'm made aware of an error that's occurred and there's potential that a patient has ingested the medication or has used the medication, my first question is the patient okay? Is that person all right? Because they are at the top of the tree for me. My feelings, regardless of how I'm feeling, come secondary. That patient always comes first. I always put the patient right at the top. Everything else is below that.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's really the way it should be. As pharmacists, healthcare professionals, our patients always come first. It's before profit. It's before personal feelings. It's before everything else. We're here to look after our patients. And if you're stressed, if you're in an environment where you've got no staff or you're working on your own, you're self-checking, and you think it's going to impact your patient care, don't do it. Not worth the risk. Worst case scenario, your patient could get a medication that you've dispensed by mistake, and it could be fatal.
Yeah, harm may occur.
Yeah.
But going back onto a very valid point you've mentioned then, just very briefly to plug pharmacist support, they've got a fantastic website for mental health and physical health well-being. And I think it's the Wardley Wellbeing portion of the website. Definitely worthwhile looking at, definitely worthwhile going through the steps that as mentioned on the website, reading the bump that's on there. It's all good stuff and it's all helpful. We all think we can handle pressure. We all think we're resilient. But the truth is, we're only resilient and we can only handle pressure to a certain point. And as Tordel's mentioned before, if you can't do it, if you're feeling things are on top of you, you've got several options. You either carry on, and believe me, the proverbial will hit the fan at some point. Or you can take time out, compose yourself and come back into it. And I frequently do that if I'm feeling a little bit under pressure. Or you just don't do it. If somebody asks you to do something which is outside your sphere of competence, or as you've signed on as an RP and things aren't going great, ultimately it is your registration. It is your career. Don't throw it away and don't jeopardize your registration because somebody is telling you you're too slow at checking, or somebody is telling you you must do your consultations faster to get more people through the door, which granted isn't going to be happening at this moment in time, but we're going to be going back to that shortly. We will be going back to normal at some point. Mm-hmm. But don't jeopardize your registration when you know for a fact you can't, or you're going to have problems doing something. It's much better to step away or to not do it than to carry on. And unfortunately, the inevitable happens.
So thanks, Paul. I think that was a real eye-opener. And I hope our listeners and our viewers, you get a good understanding of the impact of covering up, our potential impact of covering up. Hopefully, if you leave us some comments on the video or get in touch with us on Telegram, so if you have any thoughts on this, or if you have any suggestions for future episodes, any topics that you specifically like us to cover, we'll see if we can get some real cases and discuss those based on those topics. And we'll also leave the link for pharmacist support website to the area that Paul mentioned. And hopefully we'll see you on the next episode of the Pharmacy Lounge Law and Ethics podcast.